Control started as a bit of a mystery to me. It was released in the summer of 2019, but I heard nothing about it until it started receiving multitudes of nominations, as well as awards for Game of the Year and its excellence in design, story, characters, and several other aspects. So this game wound up on my list as a must-try at some point. However, when I started it up for the first time, everything just felt kind of off. Not just in an atmospheric mystery sense, but in a gameplay sense as well. This game feels very oddly put together until you get used to it. Objects have weird, seemingly random senses of weight to them sometimes, and the character model doesn't always seem to understand its own boundaries. I was curious why the game felt hurried, and it turns out it was, to an extent. While Remedy Entertainment's previous large games, Alan Wake and Quantum Break, took 7 and 5 years respectively to create, Control only took 3 years to develop and release. Remedy also kept costs low for a AAA game of this scope. In contrast to the more concrete stories of their previous releases, Remedy's development staff wanted a little bit of a looser unraveling of the game's story, so that the player was able to create more of their own experience and understanding of the world around them. Control has a narrowly focused mandatory story with exceptional amounts of extra content that can be stumbled upon and dissected by an interested player if they so choose. I ended up loving the side missions and collectible files so much that I started to get worried when I felt I was nearing the end of the game, because I didn't want to wrap it up before I had experienced everything this game had to offer. In fact, as oddly as the experience began for me, this wound up in competition for one of my favorite video game experiences of all time, certainly within my top 10. I'll try to explain exactly how it won me over without ruining any of the experience for another new player. So, let's take a careful look at what's so great about Control. As Control begins, you assume the role of Jessie Faden, a young woman in New York who has wandered into the headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Control, a fictional and secretive government organization in charge of the research and containment of paranormal anomalies. Jessie, while searching for her brother, has stumbled into the Bureau by following some sort of instinct or voice in her head. However, things are amiss upon arrival. The lobby is deserted, and upon checking any computer screens around the front desk or security checkpoint, you'll discover that the building is under an internal lockdown. You won't meet many other characters at first, other than the unseen presence that Jessie is speaking to, as well as a seemingly oblivious janitor who has a tendency of responding to Jessie's thoughts. As you wander through the deserted halls of this building, known under its bureau title as the Oldest House, you'll find the walls and rooms shifting around you, just out of sight, as they guide you either in the direction you're trying to go, or maybe the direction that the building itself wants you to go. It's hard to tell for sure. Soon after arrival, you'll commandeer a firearm that is said to be a shape-shifting tool that has been the source of many stories as a fabled weapon throughout history. You'll use this weapon to protect yourself from an infestation of otherworldly zombie-like fiends, taking the form of the employees who used to fill these halls. The amount of questions presented from the start of this game incentivizes the player to search every corner and read every scrap and document in the anticipation of filling in the blanks. There are more rooms than the required ones, and visiting them will help you piece together more lore and backstory for what's been going on at the Federal Bureau of Control before you got there. Collectibles are also maintained upon death, so the player isn't discouraged from taking their time in case they manage to fail in a combat section later on and not want to check every corner all over again. I enjoy that the story obviously focuses around Jessie and her involvement in the Bureau and why she's there right now, and what she needs to accomplish or learn. However, in a story structure sense, I love that there are dozens and dozens of other stories happening in the background, or perhaps in the past. Many of these stories can only be ascertained through collectibles or little pieces of dialogue here and there, but it reveals a lot about the inner workings of the Federal Bureau of Control, as well as the people who work there, whether in the past or present. It feels like a real office building, with complaints to HR, interdepartmental correspondence, and varying levels of need-to-know information of various clearance levels. Some popularly mentioned characters in these documents are mysteriously missing from the game, or at least from coming into contact with you. Speaking of characters whom you do come into contact with, however, all of the named positions at the Bureau are very well performed and constructed roles. Ahti is an intriguing character, and others like Marshall and Langston feel very easily understood for the limited amount of mandatory interactions you have with them. Emily Pope, your adopted research assistant, is also a great character, happily explaining the lore and mechanics of this game under the guise of her lovable job. Through optional dialogue interactions, the player can gather much more information regarding the oddities of the environment and Control's underlying story with approach to the unknown. It may not be mandatory to speak to Emily in between each chapter, but it definitely is both entertaining and informative. As I mentioned earlier, I became a little concerned once I felt I was going to finish the game before I really had my fill of it, and that is due in part to the fact that I consider some of the side missions to be even more interesting than many of your main objectives. The Bureau is such an interesting setting, and Remedy Entertainment's team did such a good job in filling it to the brim with interesting stories and characters, not just spoken roles, but even the enemies. On the topic of side quests, however, this isn't something that I see frequently in games, but your character will actually acknowledge when you have more pressing matters that draw you away from certain side missions. It makes a lot more sense in the construct of the story that you wouldn't be sidetracked for half an hour on something that is knowingly time sensitive, whether the game has imposed a literal timer or not. Some things in the context of the story are just simply more important. Control feels like the kind of game that unravels all of its mysteries right at the end for the full effect. However, just because this Bureau withholds all of its deepest secrets doesn't mean the experience is in any way vague or tiring, like an art experience game may be, while forcing its player to come up with their own interpretations of its mysteries. This game seems to expand much like an open world game, but instead of locations or means of travel presenting themselves to you, the world grows through the discovery and application of new abilities. An area that you previously assumed was a dead end could now have several new meanings or possibilities, much like the ever-expanding world of a Metroidvania game. One of the strongest draws of this game's experience is the almost superhero-esque combat style of special abilities that you will gather during your time at the Bureau. You can throw objects with telekinesis, seize enemies and make them fight alongside you, shield yourself with debris, and utilize many other cool mechanics. Control's combat is engaging, and it keeps things interesting through different means of attack and defense against wildly varying enemies. Players aren't restricted to the usual third-person shooter mechanics of dodge, cover, and fire, and instead, you can get a little kick out of perfectly utilizing each of the abilities at your disposal for a more entertaining combat experience. This game certainly plays a lot faster than many third-person action games out there, as this genre generally resorts to stealth or cover tactics in order to either make action more difficult or involved, while also lengthening out the game's experience. But in Control, as much as you don't want to let enemies get the drop on you, there is still definitely a much more energetic, guns-blazing style of action to be enjoyed by keeping your head on swivel and using your powers to shower your enemies in bullets, environmental hazards, and whatever else you can throw at them. I mean, you can literally rip chunks of concrete out of the walls to use as artillery. The environment is semi-destructible, and even those broken pieces can be used as telekinetic weapons. As you gain new abilities, you'll have new means of going on the offensive, as well as new ways to keep yourself safe. Just because you can be comfortably assertive in combat doesn't mean you can lose track of your surroundings. Your offensive and defensive capabilities are balanced and intertwined with each other, with your energy bar contributing to aspects such as your dodging as well as your telekinetic weaponry. As a related note, I love when games have canonical reasoning for video game tropes or technical requirements. Sometimes there are aspects of games that are just too difficult or specific to explain away, but it's fun when they blend into the lore of the universe, such as in Control. During your visit to the Federal Bureau of Control, you'll obviously cause a lot of damage through combat and your interactions with this moderately destructible environment. In many games, you would just have to suspend your disbelief that the building happens to go back to the way it was, because in a technical sense, it would be far too difficult to remember every piece of damage done to the entire game's map. However, in Control, you're inside the oldest house, a place of power connected to another dimension through paranormal energy. This setting is known to warp and shift as it sees fit, so it's much more understandable why that concrete you ripped out of the floor earlier has gone back to the place it belongs while you were away. Still talking to the comparison of other action games out there, I always enjoy when the back of your character in a third-person game doesn't also take up a third of your screen. It's easy to keep tallies on what's around you, where you are, and additionally, just easier to make sense of the game's environment and enjoy its design. Remedy did a great job of creating eerie and unsettling situations without turning this into a horror game. This game focuses heavily on the idea of liminal space, the sort of environments or aesthetics that you feel as though you've experienced a million times but also never seen for yourself. the sort of behind the scenes of the natural world, an office building with no one in it, or a motel you've never been to outside of a dream. This style aids in constructing a setting that feels very realistic, but not quite real, if you understand what I mean. Everything is balanced between a bureaucratic box of cement and steel and an ethereal, nightmarish realm of chaos. As an example of this world of in-between, there's not really much gore or viscera in the majority of this game. Upon arrival to the oldest house, you'll notice plenty of floating bodies, but not as much in terms of blood. In fact, even when you shoot the enemy hiss soldiers, they still don't bleed, but rather burst with a spray of incandescent rainbow mist. The lack of blood coming from these enemies really separates them from the human world and our usual way of perceiving how these things naturally happen in our reality, which is really what this game spends so much time focusing on. And as the oddities of this world grab your attention, it's definitely what you'll find yourself focusing on as well. Control does an excellent job of drawing questions out of its player. Not just those questions presented at the beginning of the game, like where are we and what's our goal, but more exciting questions once you're really in the thick of it. Questions like, what power will I get next, or what's waiting for me in the next room? If you're really in the mood for piecing together some information, the notes and folders left around the now abandoned office desks are great ways of giving yourself both more questions and answers if you're really enjoying your time in Control's world. Even the detail of redacted need-to-know information encourages players to fill in the blanks, using context of other knowledge they've accumulated throughout their adventure. These files aren't just for the narrative-inclined players either. Reading some of the collectible documents will help you solve puzzles for side quests and bonus challenges. Remedy's approach to having a focused mandatory story with boatloads of optional content surrounding it was the perfect way to present their otherworldly adventure. The combat and exploration are continuously fun, and straightforward enough that an action star at heart can have a blast plowing their way through paranormal zombie soldiers from one sector to the other. Those with an aesthetic interest will have a great time scanning their horizons in every new room and department sector as they take in the strangely appealing layout and decor of the Bureau's sleek retro look, bleeding together with the void-like presence of that liminal design we discussed earlier. I knew that plenty of people enjoyed this game, but I can't really explain how much I was blown away by this title. My expectations may honestly have been a little low, seeing as how I was experiencing it through the less than optimal console version, but even if it were held together by duct tape, this game's story, combat, and design all created such a memorable and succinct experience that it would be a shame for it all to fly under anyone's radar. That is what's so great about Control. Thank you all for joining us on this episode of What's So Great About Gaming, as we gathered more information on the world of Control. Make sure to tell us what you think about Control, or even suggest a game for another video. If you want to help in supporting the channel, consider checking out our Discord, Twitch, or Patreon. Links for all of those are in the description. If you want to hear what's great about another game, check out the link to our last episode, Super Mario Sunshine, on screen or in the description. And please take the time to subscribe to be involved in the discussions here. Thanks again for watching. Now go play a great game. We'll see you next time.